In 1834 Kentucky, the family that poisoned the whole town wasn't who you'd expect. They died screaming. All 6 victims, same night, same symptoms. Convulsions that twisted their bodies like broken dolls, foam at their mouths, eyes rolled back, seeing things that weren't there, or maybe things that were. The town of Willow Creek knew who to blame. The Whitlock family, the apothecary, the outsiders who mixed death in bottles and sold it for 30 cents. But what if they were wrong? 17-year-old Clara Whitlock watched her neighbors become a mob, watched them nail her father's hands to timber and drag him to a cell, watched them plan a hanging that would satisfy their hunger for blood. Then she found the grain purple, glowing, moving like it was alive. What Clara discovered in that rotting mill would shatter everything Willow Creek believed about good and evil. The real killer wasn't human. It was ancient, invisible, patient. It had been feeding on this town for months, hiding in their bread, their porridge, their children's meals. And someone was helping it. The mayor smiled too much. The mill owner's hand shook when he counted his money. The doctor who could prove Clara's theory died when his steamboat exploded in perfect weather. Coincidence? Or was something darker protecting itself? As her father awaited the news, Clara raced to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest halls of power. Every door she opened led to another secret. Every question she asked put another target on her family's back. They beat her brother bloody, called her hysterical, promised to hang her entire bloodline if she didn't stay silent. But Clara had seen the truth growing in the dark, festering, waiting, and she knew that if she failed, Willow Creek wouldn't just lose one innocent family, it would lose its soul to something far more poisonous than any grain fungus. Some evils wear respectable faces, some murders happen in broad daylight, and sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones we vote into office. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The church bell rang 6 times as dawn broke over Willow Creek. Each deep iron toll counted another pine coffin being carried from the infirmary to the cemetery. Clara Whitlock stood on the porch of her family's apothecary, watching the solemn procession wind down Main Street. Her breath misted in the cool morning air as townspeople lined the wooden sidewalks, their faces grim with grief and something darker, suspicion. "You may say all 6 drank your papa's cough tonic," whispered Mrs. Henderson, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Drank it down and never woke up." Clara's stomach twisted. 6 people dead in one night. The blacksmith, the baker's wife, 2 children, an elderly farmer, and the ferryman's daughter. All had come to their shop the day before. All had purchased bottles of Jonas Whitlock's famous cough remedy. And now all lay cold in wooden boxes. Her father emerged from the shop, his war-scarred hands trembling as he locked the door. Jonas Whitlock looked older than his 43 years, his hair gone gray at the temples, his eyes hollow from nightmares that still visited him from his soldiering days. Behind him came Clara's younger brothers, Silas, 14, and always ready for a fight, and 9-year-old Eli, who clutched his sketchbook against his chest. "Papa," Clara said quietly, "what's happening?" Jonas's voice came out rough. "Sheriff Wade wants to test the tonics. Says it's just procedure." But his eyes told a different story. They both knew procedure in Willow Creek meant guilt, until proven innocent. As the funeral procession passed, Clara noticed something that made her skin crawl. Down by the ferry landing, sacks of grain sat stacked in the morning light. Dark stains spread across the burlap, and she could swear she saw a faint purple shimmer, like mold or fungus growing in the damp Kentucky air. "Look at them," Silas muttered, nodding toward the crowd. "Looking at us like we're murderers." Clara watched Mayor Abner Crane step forward from the group of mourners. His smile was too bright for a funeral morning, his waistcoat too clean, his manner too eager. "Jonas," he called out, "might we have a word?" The townspeople closed in around them like a noose. Clara felt the weight of their stares, their whispered accusations. Someone had nailed a crude wooden sign to their door, "Poisoner" carved in angry letters. By sunset the signs had multiplied. Killer, murderer, justice for the dead. Clara stood on the same porch where she'd watched the morning funeral, but now she watched her neighbors become a mob. That night, the Whitlock family gathered around their kitchen table in the living quarters behind the shop. The oil lantern flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jonas had cooked a simple supper of cornbread and beans, but none of them had much appetite. "I checked every ingredient 3 times, Jonas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The honey, the whiskey, the herbs, all the same as always." Clara pushed food around her plate. "Papa, I saw something today, down at the ferry landing. The grain sacks looked wrong." "Wrong how?" Jonas asked. "Purple mold, growing on the outside of the burlap, and they smelled sweet but not right, like rotting fruit." Jonas frowned. "Lyman Crow brought those in from upriver. Said there was a shortage at the regular mill, so he had to buy from smaller farms." He paused. "I used some of that grain to make syrup, stretched the tonic ingredients when supplies ran low." Eli looked up from his sketchbook, where he'd been drawing the church bell. "Mama used to say purple mold was bad, real bad." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Their mother had died of fever 3 years ago, but she'd been the smartest person Clara ever knew. If Mama had warned about purple mold. A sound from outside made them all freeze. Footsteps on the front porch, then more footsteps. Voices whispered in the darkness. "Silas," Jonas said quietly. "Blow out the lamp." They sat in darkness, listening to the sounds of people moving around their building. Someone rattled the front door handle. Another voice suggested they smoked them out. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Then the footsteps moved away and the voices faded into the night. But the message was clear. Willow Creek had decided the Whitlock family was guilty. Later, after Jonas thought everyone was asleep, Silas slipped out through the back window. Clara heard the soft creak of wood and knew her stubborn brother had gone to check on his friends to see how bad things really were. He returned near midnight, and Clara pretended to sleep as he climbed back through the window. But she saw the bruises on his face in the moonlight, and she heard him crying quietly into his pillow. "They called us murderers," he whispered when he realized she was awake. "Every last one of them. Said Papa fed poison to good people for money." Clara stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring more accusations, more anger, more danger. But somewhere in the back of her mind, her mother's voice echoed. Purple mold was bad, real bad. First light was just touching the horizon when the knocking started. Not the polite rap of customers or neighbors, but the hard, demanding pounding of authority. Clara jolted awake on her narrow bed and heard her father's boots hit the floor in the next room. "Jonas Whitlock." Sheriff Matthias Wade's voice boomed through the wooden door. "Open up in the name of the law." Clara threw on her dress and rushed to the main room, where Jonas was already unlocking the front door. Behind Sheriff Wade stood 3 members of the town council, including Mayor Crane, whose smile looked hungry in the dawn light. "Sheriff," Jonas said calmly, though Clara could see his hands shaking. "How can I help you?" "Jonas Whitlock," Wade announced formally. "You are under arrest for suspicion of malicious dosing with intent to harm. You will come with us for questioning by the town council." "No!" Clara stepped forward, but her father caught her arm. "It's all right," Jonas said quietly. "I've done nothing wrong. The truth will come out." But Clara knew better. She'd seen lynch mobs before during the cholera panic 2 summers ago. Fear made people stupid and cruel. They needed someone to blame, and Jonas Whitlock made an easy target. As Sheriff Wade bound her father's hands with iron shackles, Clara felt desperation rising in her throat. "Wait, you can't just—" "Clara," a gentle voice interrupted. Reverend Everett Boone stepped forward from the crowd that had gathered to watch. "Might I suggest that you and your brothers take sanctuary at the church until this matter is resolved?" Mayor Crane's eyes narrowed. "That won't be necessary, Reverend," The children are free to go where they please. Nevertheless, Boone said firmly, I believe they would be more comfortable in the Lord's house during this difficult time. Clara understood. The Reverend was offering protection without saying so directly. She nodded quickly. Yes, sir, that would be good. As Sheriff Wade led Jonas toward the waiting wagon, her father turned back one last time. His lips moved silently, but Clara could read the words, Find the truth. The shackles clinked as he climbed into the wagon bed. Clara watched until the wheels disappeared around the bend toward the jail, carrying away the last parent she had left in the world. Come along, children, Reverend Boone said gently. Let's gather what you need. But Clara was already thinking ahead. The truth was out there somewhere, hidden in purple mold and whispered lies, and she was going to find it before they put a rope around her father's neck. The iron shackles had felt cold against Jonas's wrists, but Clara felt something colder still, the certainty that time was running out. The church attic felt like a different world. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through dusty windows, illuminating stacks of old hymnals and forgotten furniture. Reverend Boone had made a comfortable space for them with quilts and cushions, and the smell of beeswax candles mixed with old wood and leather. This is Mercy Graves, Boone said, introducing a tall, sharp-eyed woman who'd been arranging blankets when they arrived. She keeps house for me and helps with the church records. Mercy looked to be about 30, with intelligent dark eyes and hands that moved with quick precision. She studied Clara with the same careful attention Clara had learned to pay to suspicious-looking herbs. Pleased to meet you, Mercy said, her voice crisp and educated. Reverend Boone told me about your situation. I'm sorry for your troubles. Thank you, Clara replied, though she wondered why a housekeeper spoke like she'd had schooling. Most folks in Willow Creek had barely scratched their names in the dirt. Eli had already claimed a corner where he could spread out his drawings, while Silas prowled the space like a caged animal. But Clara found herself drawn to a stack of leather-bound books on a small table near Mercy's chair. What are those? She asked. Mercy's smile was knowing. I keep records. Who said what to whom, when strange things happen, who owes money and who's got secrets. She opened the top book. Your father's troubles didn't start yesterday, child. Clara leaned closer. Mercy's handwriting was neat as a school primer, with dates and names lined up in careful columns. Look here, Mercy pointed. 3 weeks ago, old Mrs. Patterson had a fainting spell after eating bread from the miller. 2 weeks ago, the Hendricks boy came down with shaking fits. Last week, Sarah Morrison's baby wouldn't stop crying after she nursed him. And she'd eaten cornbread made from the same grain shipment. You think the grain's been making people sick all along? Clara asked. I think, Mercy said carefully, that 6 deaths in one night got people's attention. But folks have been feeling poorly for weeks. They just didn't connect it to their food. Clara felt pieces clicking together in her mind like puzzle blocks. The grain comes from Lyman Crow's mill. Papa used grain syrup in his tonics when other ingredients got scarce. And everyone who died had money to spend on medicine, Mercy added. Poor folks tough out their coughs with whiskey and prayer. Silas stopped pacing and turned toward them. So you're saying Papa's innocent? I'm saying, Mercy replied, that your Papa used tainted grain, same as everyone else. But he didn't know it was tainted, and he sure didn't taint it himself. Thunder rumbled outside the windows. Clara felt a strange mix of hope and fear rising in her chest. If they could prove the grain was poisoned, they could save Papa. But first, they had to convince a town that had already made up its mind. Rain began pattering against the glass as the first evening candles flickered to life. Somewhere in the darkness, Jonas sat in a jail cell, and somewhere else the real killer was hiding in plain sight, disguised as something as innocent as daily bread. Thunder crashed overhead as Clara, Mercy, and Silas slipped through the church's back door into the storm-lashed night. Rain soaked through Clara's woolen cloak within minutes, but she pressed forward toward the dark bulk of Lyman Crow's mill beside the river. This is madness, Silas whispered. but he followed anyway, loyal as always. Madness is letting Papa hang for something he didn't do, Clara shot back. The mill loomed before them, its great water wheel silent in the storm. Mercy produced a key from her pocket. Lyman owes Reverend Boone for his wife's funeral. He won't miss this for one night. Inside, the mill smelled of damp grain and machine oil. Clara lit the small lantern she'd brought, while Mercy and Silas felt their way through the darkness. The sound of rain on the wooden roof drummed overhead like 1,000 impatient fingers. "Over here," Mercy called. "The grain bins." Clara raised the lantern and gasped. The rye stored in the back bins glowed with an eerie violet phosphorescence. Fuzzy purple mold covered the grain like a diseased carpet, and the sweet, sickly smell made her stomach turn. "Dear Lord," Mercy breathed. "It looks like something from a nightmare." Clara pulled out 3 small glass vials she'd taken from her father's shop and began collecting samples of the moldy grain. The stuff felt oily and wrong under her fingers. Mama's medical journal mentions something called ergot, a fungus that grows on rye when it's stored too damp. She said it could cause convulsions, madness, even death. "Look at this," Silas called from deeper in the mill. He pointed to newer grain sacks stacked near the front. "The good grain's up here where anyone visiting would see it. The bad stuff's hidden in back." A sound from outside made them all freeze. Footsteps on the wooden walkway, slow and deliberate. Clara quickly capped her vials and doused the lantern, plunging them into darkness. The door creaked open. "Hello?" Lyman Crow's nervous voice echoed through the mill. "Someone there?" They pressed back behind the grain sacks, hardly daring to breathe. Clara could hear her heart hammering and hoped it wasn't loud enough for Crow to notice. Footsteps moved through the mill, pausing at each bin. "Damn rats," Crow muttered. "Always getting into everything." Finally, the footsteps retreated and the door slammed shut. They waited until the sound of his boots faded before moving again. "We need to get back," Mercy whispered. They slipped out into the storm, Clara clutching her precious vials. Rain washed the purple mold residue from her hands, but she could still feel its oily wrongness under her fingernails. By the time they reached the church, dawn was breaking gray and wet over Willow Creek. Clara had evidence now, but would anyone believe a teenage girl with muddy skirts and wild theories about poisoned grain? The answer, she suspected, would determine whether Jonas Whitlock lived to see another sunset. The town hall buzzed with nervous energy as Clara stood before the 5-man council the next morning. Mayor Crane sat in the center chair, flanked by the banker, the judge, the mill supervisor, and a visiting dignitary from the county seat. Their faces ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Clara placed her glass vials on the wooden table with steady hands, though her heart raced like a spooked horse. "Gentlemen, I believe I know what killed those 6 people. And it wasn't my father's medicine." Mayor Crane leaned back in his chair, his smile condescending. "Ms. Whitlock, we appreciate your concern for your father, but these proceedings are for men to handle." "This is ergot poisoning," Clara continued, ignoring the dismissal. She pulled out her mother's leather-bound medical journal, its pages yellow with age. "My mother documented several cases she'd seen during her nursing work. The symptoms match exactly: convulsions, hallucinations, difficulty breathing, and death within hours." Judge Harrington squinted at the moldy grain samples. "And you found this where, young lady?" "In Lyman Crow's mill, hidden in the back bins, covered with fresh grain to disguise it." The council members exchanged glances. Clara could see them thinking, hysterical girl, grieving daughter, desperate lies. "Ms. Whitlock," the banker said smoothly, "surely you understand that wild accusations against respected businessmen cannot be taken seriously, especially from someone with such obvious bias. But the evidence, Mayor Crane interrupted, "is that 6 people died after taking your father's tonics. That's a fact. Your theories about grain mold are just that, theories." Clara felt anger burning in her chest. "Then test it. Feed some of this grain to animals and see what happens." "We don't have time for elaborate experiments," Judge Harrington said. "The people want justice. They want answers, and frankly, young lady, your father's guilt keeps the peace better than your wild stories about poisoned grain." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. They knew. Deep down, they had to know Jonas was innocent. But they needed a scapegoat, and Jonas Whitlock was convenient. Furthermore, Mayor Crane added, if these accusations against Mr. Crow were to spread, they could damage the economic stability of our community. Mill work provides jobs for dozens of families. Clara gathered her vials and journal with shaking hands. Outside the hall, a crowd had gathered. As she emerged, someone shouted, "There's the poisoner's daughter!" Others took up the cry, their faces twisted with anger and grief. Mrs. Henderson spat in the dirt near Clara's feet. "Your papa killed my nephew. Killed him for 30 cents. Clara clutched her mother's journal against her chest and ran. Behind her, the crowd's angry voices echoed off the buildings like the baying of hounds. Truth, she realized, was a luxury Willow Creek couldn't afford. The river dock stretched into the muddy current like a wooden finger. Clara stood at its end, watching the afternoon steamboat from Frankfurt unload passengers and cargo. Among them, she spotted Dr. Samuel Price, a traveling physician she'd met briefly when he'd stopped at their shop the week before. Dr. Price was a thin, energetic man with kind eyes behind wire spectacles. He carried a leather medical bag and wore the confident air of someone who'd seen enough of the world to keep an open mind. "Dr. Price," Clara called, hurrying toward him. "Please, I need your help." He turned, surprised. "Miss Whitlock, isn't it? I heard about your father's troubles. Terrible business." "That's just it," Clara said urgently. "I don't think he's guilty. I think I know what really killed those people." She pulled out her glass vials of moldy grain. Dr. Price examined the samples with genuine interest, sniffing them carefully and holding them up to the light. "Ergot sclerotia," he said after a moment. "Nasty stuff. I've seen ergot poisoning in France and Germany. The symptoms match what I heard about your recent deaths." Clara's heart leaped. "You believe me?" "Science doesn't care about belief, young lady. Evidence is evidence." He pulled out a notepad and began writing. "I'm heading to Louisville, where there's a proper laboratory. I can have these samples tested by real chemists. It will take a few days, but I can send official results back to your sheriff." "Would you testify?" Clara asked desperately. "If they put Papa on trial?" Dr. Price handed her a written affidavit. "This states my professional opinion about these samples and my willingness to return as an expert witness. Guard it carefully. It might save your father's life." Clara tucked the precious document inside her mother's journal. "Thank you. Thank you so much." The steamboat whistle blew, calling passengers to board. Dr. Price gathered his bags. "Keep faith, Miss Whitlock. Truth has a way of surfacing even in the murkiest waters." Clara watched from the dock as the steamboat churned upriver, black smoke trailing from its twin stacks. Dr. Price stood at the rail and waved until the boat rounded the bend toward Louisville and disappeared from sight. For the first time since the nightmare began, Clara felt something like hope. Professional validation of her theory. Written testimony from a respected doctor, evidence that could free her father and expose the real source of the poisoning. As twilight settled over the river, she walked back toward town, clutching the affidavit like a talisman. The steamboat's whistle echoed faintly from the distance, growing fainter with each mile. Soon, Dr. Price's voice would reach the authorities in Louisville. Soon, the truth would triumph over fear and ignorance. Clara had no way of knowing that within 24 hours, both the doctor and her precious evidence would be at the bottom of the Kentucky River. Late that night, Silas slipped through the shadows toward the family pharmacy. The building stood dark and abandoned, its windows boarded up like dead eyes. The signs calling his father a murderer had multiplied, nailed to every available surface. All he wanted was their family Bible. It seemed important somehow to keep something sacred safe while everything else fell apart. The back door lock was broken, probably from the council's search, so he slipped inside easily. The shop felt like a tomb. Glass bottles caught faint moonlight, throwing strange shadows on the walls. Medical instruments lay scattered where searchers had left them. The whole place smelled of herbs and abandonment. Silas found the Bible on the shelf behind the counter, its leather cover worn smooth by his mother's hands. As he tucked it under his coat, he heard voices outside. "This'll teach 'em to poison good folk," someone said. "Shoulda done this days ago," another voice agreed. Silas pressed against the wall as footsteps surrounded the building. Through a crack in the boarded window, he saw torches moving in the darkness, 4 or 5 men, their faces hidden by bandanas. "Check the back," one ordered. "Make sure nobody's inside." Panic shot through Silas like lightning. He looked around desperately for another way out, but the men were already at the back door. Heavy boots stomped into the shop. "Nobody here," a voice called. "Let's get on with it." The smell of coal oil reached Silas's hiding spot behind the counter. They were splashing it on the walls, on the wooden shelves, on everything his father had built over years of careful work. "Just the storage shed," the leader said. "Don't want to burn down half the street." Silas held his breath as they moved toward the back of the building, toward the shed where his father stored larger supplies. A match scratched in the darkness, and suddenly orange light flickered through the boards. Smoke began seeping through the walls. Silas clutched the Bible and ran for the front door, no longer caring who saw him. He burst into the street just as flames erupted from the storage shed behind the shop. "There's the boy," someone shouted. "Get him!" Hands grabbed at Silas, but he was fast and desperate. He twisted away from the first man, ducked under the second's reaching arms, and sprinted toward the church. Behind him, boots pounded on wooden sidewalks and angry voices shouted for him to stop. A fist caught his shoulder, spinning him around. Another blow landed on his ribs, driving the air from his lungs. The Bible flew from his hands and landed in the mud. "This is what you get for protecting murderers," someone snarled. More blows fell on his back, his arms, his face. Silas curled into a ball around the precious Bible and waited for it to end. The beating stopped when Reverend Boone's voice cut through the night like a sword. "Enough!" The Reverend stood in the street, holding a lantern and a shotgun. "In the name of Christian decency, enough!" The masked men melted away into the darkness, leaving Silas bleeding in the mud. Smoke from the burning shed stained the night sky, and embers drifted down like poisoned snow. Boone helped Silas to his feet, supporting his weight as they walked slowly back to the church. Other townspeople emerged from their homes, but they stood and watched the fire burn without lifting a finger to help. "They won't stop," Silas gasped through split lips. "They want us all dead." In the church attic, Clara bathed her brother's wounds and made a silent vow. Willow Creek had drawn blood from her family for the last time. Tomorrow she would find a way to clear Jonas's name, or she would die trying. The town would not claim another Willock. Not while she still drew breath. Morning brought terrible news to the town square. Posters appeared on every building, nailed up during the night by unseen hands, hanging set for Sunday in bold black letters. Below, in smaller print, "Justice for the poisoned dead." Clara read the announcement with cold dread. Today was Friday. Sunday was 2 days away. As if the execution notice wasn't horror enough, 2 more people had fallen ill during the night. The tailor's apprentice and the grocer's daughter both showed the same symptoms: convulsions, fever, difficulty breathing. Both had eaten bread from Mayor Crane's private granary, which supplied flour to several households. "It's spreading," Mercy said grimly as she updated her records, "and it's not coming from your father's medicine bottles." Clara studied Mercy's careful notes and sketched a rough map on brown paper. Every case of illness, from the first mild symptoms weeks ago to last night's new victims, connected to grain shipments from specific sources. The pattern was clear as daylight to anyone willing to look. "Mayor Crane's been buying cheap grain from upstream," Clara said, tracing lines between locations with her finger. "Probably moldy rye that other buyers rejected. He's selling it at regular prices and pocketing the difference." "Who people die?" Mercy added quietly. The afternoon heat pressed down on Willow Creek like a damp blanket. Clara walked the dusty streets, showing her map to anyone who would listen. Most folks turned away or hurried past with frightened faces. A few spat in the dirt at her feet. But Mrs. Patterson, the old woman who'd had one of the first fainting spells, studied the map carefully. "My bread did taste different lately," she admitted. "Sweet, but wrong, somehow. Made my stomach churn." "When did you first notice it?" Clara asked. 3 weeks ago, when Crane started selling his flour direct instead of through the general store. Said he could offer better prices." Mrs. Patterson's wrinkled face creased with worry. "You really think it's the grain making folks sick?" "I'm certain of it," Clara said. "Will you help me prove it?" But Mrs. Patterson was already backing away. "I can't get involved, child. I'm sorry about your papa, but I can't afford to cross the mayor. He holds my late husband's debt." Clara watched the old woman hurry away, understanding the fear that controlled this town. Mayor Crane didn't just sell grain. He controlled credit, property, jobs. Speaking against him meant economic ruin for most families. As sunset approached, Clara returned to the church with her map covered in notes and testimonies. She had evidence, she had pattern, she had scientific theory. What she didn't have was power. In his jail cell, Jonas awaited the rope. In the mayor's granary, poisoned grain waited for the next batch of victims. And somewhere in the space between truth and justice, Clara had to find a way to save them all. 2 days until Sunday, 2 days to change a town's mind, 2 days to prove that sometimes the most dangerous poison came wrapped in a politician's smile. The church basement felt like a hidden laboratory as Clara and Mercy worked by candlelight. They had borrowed several glass jars from the Reverend's preserves and turned them into makeshift cages for the church mice that scurried through the walls. "I feel terrible about this," Clara said as she ground poisoned rye into powder with a mortar and pestle. "These little creatures might save your father's life," Mercy replied, carefully measuring out small portions of different grain samples, "and prevent more people from dying." They had 6 jars total. 2 contained mice fed with clean grain from the general store. 2 received grain from Mayor Crane's private stock. The final 2 got samples of the moldy rye Clara had taken from Lyman Crow's mill. The results came quickly. Within an hour, the mice that had eaten the moldy rye began showing distress. Their movements became jerky and uncoordinated. One suffered visible convulsions. By midnight, both had died. The mice fed Crane's grain showed milder symptoms: restlessness, loss of appetite, trembling, but remained alive. The control group stayed healthy and active. "It's the same poisoning," Clara said, documenting everything in careful handwriting. "Different concentrations, but the same cause. Crane's grain is contaminated, but not as badly as what Crow is hiding." Mercy labeled each jar with dates and symptoms. "This proves your theory. The question is whether anyone will believe 2 women conducting experiments in a church basement." They worked until dawn, recording every detail. When Reverend Boone found them asleep on the pews a few hours later, surrounded by jars and notebooks, he simply covered them with a blanket and let them rest. Clara woke to the sound of church bells ringing the noon hour. Her back ached from sleeping on wooden benches, but her mind felt clear and determined. She had scientific evidence now, real proof that grain contamination was killing people, not Jonas's medicine. All she had to do was convince a town that had already decided her father's guilt, a town controlled by the very man whose corruption she was trying to expose, a town where fear and anger had replaced logic and justice. Looking at her carefully labeled jars and detailed notes, Clara felt like a student preparing for the most important examination of her life. Except the stakes weren't grades or graduation, they were life and death, truth and lies, justice and mob rule. Outside, cricket songs drifted through the church windows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to present her evidence. But tonight, surrounded by the tools of careful investigation, Clara allowed herself to hope. Science didn't lie. Evidence didn't change its story based on politics or profit, and somewhere in that certainty, she found the strength to keep fighting. Dawn fog hung over Mayor Crane's farm like a gray shroud as Clara and Silas crept toward the grain silo. The large wooden structure stood behind the main barn, its peaked roof disappearing into the mist. Clara carried empty vials in her pockets, while Silas kept watch for any sign of movement from the farmhouse. "This is dangerous," Silas whispered, his bruised face still tender from the beating. "If Crane catches us, then we'll face that when it happens," Clara replied, though her hands shook as she worked the lock with a bent piece of wire. "Papa faces the rope in less than 2 days. This might be our last chance." The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside the silo. The smell hit them immediately. Sweet rot mixed with grain dust, making Clara's eyes water. Silas lit their small lantern, revealing the truth she'd suspected. The silo was a study in deception. Fresh golden wheat was piled near the entrance where anyone making a casual inspection would see it, but deeper inside, hidden under layers of clean grain, lay pockets of dark moldy rye that reeked of decay. "Look at this," Clara said, pulling back wheat to reveal purple-stained grain underneath. "He's been mixing good wheat with rotten rye, selling it as pure flour." She filled her vials quickly while Silas kept the lantern steady. The contaminated grain felt oily and wrong under her fingers, and she had to fight down nausea as she worked. "Clara," Silas hissed, "someone's coming." Through the silo's small window, Clara saw a lantern bobbing toward them across the farmyard. Mayor Crane's voice carried through the fog, talking to someone about checking the morning deliveries. They doused their light and pressed against the far wall, hardly daring to breathe. The silo door creaked open, and footsteps entered. Clara clutched her vials and prayed the mayor wouldn't notice the disturbed grain. "Everything looks normal," Crane said to his companion. "We'll start loading wagons at first light." The footsteps moved closer to where they hid. Clara felt Silas tense beside her, ready to fight if necessary. But then a loud clang from outside, a cow knocking over a milk pail, drew Crane's attention away. "Damn animals," he muttered, heading back toward the door. "Come on, let's check the barn." They waited until the voices faded before moving again. As they prepared to leave, Clara spotted something else, a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a grain sack. She grabbed it quickly, recognizing the handwriting as Crane's careful script. They slipped out of the silo and ran toward the fence line, but Silas caught his foot on a wooden stake and went down hard. His ankle twisted under him with an audible pop. "Go on," he gasped. "I'll catch up." But Clara wouldn't leave her brother. She hauled him to his feet and half-carried him toward the fence as dogs began barking from the direction of the farmhouse. They scrambled over the wooden rails just as lantern light appeared in the distance. By the time they reached the church, Silas could barely walk and Clara's dress was torn from fence barbs. But she had what she'd come for, proof of Mayor Crane's deception in her own handwriting. The ledger showed months of purchases, cheap, damaged grain bought at deep discounts and mixed with just enough good wheat to hide the contamination. Profits had been enormous, while the health consequences fell on unsuspecting customers. As Reverend Boone helped bandage Silas's ankle, Clara studied the evidence she'd gathered. She had samples, she had records, she had scientific proof, but she also had a terrible certainty that none of it would matter if the people of Willow Creek refused to listen. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation. Truth against power, evidence against fear. A teenage girl against a corrupt system that preferred convenient lies to inconvenient justice. Clara pressed her mother's medical journal against her chest and whispered a prayer for strength. The fog outside was lifting, but the fog of ignorance and corruption still hung heavy over Willow Creek. The confrontation came at mid-morning when Mayor Crane arrived at the church with 2 council members and Sheriff Wade. His face was red with anger, and his usually perfect appearance showed signs of a hurried morning. Coat buttoned wrong, hair uncombed, boots muddy from searching his property. "Reverend Boone," Crane announced loudly enough for half the congregation to hear, "I'm here about thieves. Someone broke into my grain silo last night and stole valuable property." Boone stepped forward calmly, his hands folded. "That's a serious accusation, Mayor. Do you have evidence of this theft?" "I have a disturbed silo and missing grain samples," Crane replied, "and I have witnesses who saw figures running from my property in the early morning hours." Clara felt ice in her stomach, but she stepped out from behind the Reverend. "What kind of grain was disturbed, Mayor Crane?" The question caught him off guard. What does that matter? Theft is theft. It matters, Clara continued, because if someone stole evidence of contaminated grain being sold as pure food, that might be a different kind of crime entirely. Mayor Crane's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you confessing to trespassing on my property, Miss Whitlock? I'm confessing to trying to save my father's life, Clara replied, and trying to save this town from poisoned food. The council members exchanged glances. Sheriff Wade looked uncomfortable, his hand resting on his pistol, more from habit than threat. This is ridiculous, Crane said. Reverend, you're harboring criminals. The council votes to bar the Whitlock family from Sunday services until this matter is resolved. You can't do that, Boone protested. This is a house of God, open to all. We can and we will, Judge Harrington spoke up. The peace of this community is more important than the convenience of accused criminals. Clara felt the walls closing in around them. Even the church, their last sanctuary, was being taken away. She thought of her father sitting in his jail cell, probably hearing the angry voices outside and losing what little hope remained. Furthermore, Mayor Crane added, if any more wild accusations are made against respected businessmen, the council will consider charges of slander and incitement. The threat was clear. Keep quiet or face arrest yourselves. As the officials left, Clara collapsed onto a church pew and let herself cry for the first time since the nightmare began. Silas sat beside her, his injured ankle propped up, and Mercy placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Deep down, Clara said through her tears, deep down, they have to know Papa's innocent, but they don't care. Barry protects itself, Mercy said quietly. Always has, always will. Outside, rain began pattering against the church windows. Storm clouds were gathering, and Clara could feel the pressure building in more ways than one. Tomorrow was Saturday. Sunday brought the hanging. And somewhere in this town, people were still eating contaminated grain, still getting sick, still suffering, while the real culprit hid behind politics and profit. The afternoon stretched ahead like a dark tunnel with no visible light at the end. Sunset painted the river red as Clara stood on the wooden dock, watching for the steamboat from Louisville. Dr. Price should be returning with laboratory results that would vindicate her father and expose the truth about the poisoned grain. She clutched his written affidavit in her sweaty palm, the paper worn soft from constant handling. The steamboat appeared around the bend right on schedule, its twin smokestacks trailing black smoke against the crimson sky. Clara's heart hammered with anticipation as the boat approached the dock, whistle shrieking its arrival. But something was wrong. Instead of the usual passenger boat, this was a different vessel entirely. Smaller, soot-stained, flying a flag at half-mast. What happened to the regular boat? Clara asked the dockmaster as crew members began unloading cargo. His face was grim. Haven't you heard? The Memphis Belle exploded yesterday morning, 20 miles upriver. Boiler gave way, killed everyone aboard. Clara felt the world tilt around her. Everyone, every soul, passengers, crew, cargo, all of it's at the bottom now. Terrible thing. They're still pulling wreckage from the water. Dr. Price was dead. The laboratory results were destroyed. Her scientific evidence lay scattered across the river bottom, along with the kindly physician who'd believed her story. Clara sank onto a wooden crate, the affidavit fluttering from her numb fingers. Without Dr. Price's testimony, without the official laboratory analysis, she had nothing but the word of a desperate daughter and experiments conducted in a church basement. Miss, you all right? The dockmaster looked concerned. She nodded automatically and retrieved the paper, though it felt meaningless now. Dr. Price's promise to return as an expert witness was just ink on paper, no more valuable than a child's drawing. As she walked slowly back toward town, Clara heard the sounds of celebration spilling from the taverns. Men were drinking and singing, working themselves into the kind of mood that led to rope and torches. Tomorrow night they would gather again, but for a different purpose. There she is, someone shouted as she passed the Willow Creek Saloon. The poisoner's daughter. More voices joined in, ugly and slurred with whiskey. "Your pa's gonna swing tomorrow, about time justice got served." Clara pulled her shawl tighter and walked faster, but the voices followed her down the street. By the time she reached the church, her heart was racing and her hands were shaking. Inside, Reverend Boone took one look at her face and understood. "The doctor? Dead," Clara whispered. "The steamboat exploded. Everything's gone." Mercy looked up from her ledgers. "Not everything, child. We still have the truth." But truth without power was just noise. Truth without evidence was just opinion. And truth without allies was just the desperate protest of a condemned family. Thunder rumbled overhead as the first drops of rain began falling. Clara stared out the church window at the darkening sky and felt her last hope drowning in the muddy waters of the Kentucky River. Tomorrow was Saturday. Sunday brought the rope, and Dr. Samuel Price's voice would never reach the authorities in Louisville, never testify to the scientific reality of ergot poisoning, never save Jonas Whitlock from the mob's twisted sense of justice. The rain grew heavier, washing away the day's heat, but none of its despair. Night fell over Willow Creek like a funeral shroud, but the darkness brought no peace. Clara could hear the crowd gathering before she saw them, voices growing louder and angrier with each round of drinks, boots stomping on wooden sidewalks, the ugly sound of mob courage building like a storm. "They're coming," Silas said from the church window, his young face pale in the candlelight. Clara looked outside and felt her blood turn to ice. Dozens of men marched down Main Street carrying torches and ropes, their faces twisted with drink and righteous fury. Someone had convinced them that waiting until Sunday was too long, that justice demanded immediate satisfaction. "Bring out the murderers," a voice shouted from the crowd. "We know you're hiding them." Reverend Boone grabbed his shotgun and positioned himself at the church door. "You'll not take 'em," he called out firmly. "This is God's house, and they're under His protection." "Your God won't save poisoners," someone yelled back. "Stand aside, preacher, or get hurt with them." The crowd surged forward, and Clara saw her worst fears coming true. They weren't just after Jonas anymore. They wanted the whole family. In their twisted logic, guilt ran in the blood, and every Whitlock deserved to hang. The church door exploded inward as a dozen men rushed inside. Reverend Boone fought bravely, swinging his shotgun like a club, but he was outnumbered and overwhelmed. Clara screamed as rough hands grabbed Silas, dragging him toward the door despite his injured ankle. "Leave him alone," Clara lunged forward, clawing at the men who held her brother. A fist caught her across the face, sending her sprawling. Through blurred vision, she saw Mercy trying to help Reverend Boone, who lay bleeding from a head wound. The church that had been their sanctuary was now a battlefield. They dragged Silas into the street while Clara stumbled after them. The crowd had formed a rough circle, and someone had thrown a rope over the church bell tower. Her 14-year-old brother stood in the center, blood trickling from his nose, looking terrifyingly small and young. "You want to know about poisoning?" A drunk voice slurred. "We'll show you what happens to poisoners." "Stop!" Clara screamed, throwing herself between Silas and the mob. "He's just a boy. He never hurt anyone." Sheriff Wade appeared at the edge of the crowd, his face conflicted. Clara could see him wrestling with duty and conscience, knowing this was wrong, but uncertain how to stop it without bloodshed. "Enough!" Wade finally shouted, firing his pistol into the air. "Disperse, all of you. There'll be no lynching in my jurisdiction." The crowd wavered, torn between mob fury and respect for the law. In that moment of hesitation, Clara made a desperate decision. "You want justice?" she called out, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Then let me prove my father's innocence. Give me until dawn, and I'll show you who really poisoned this town." Mayor Crane pushed through the crowd, his face dark with anger. "Enough delays. The boy hangs now. The father hangs Sunday." But Sheriff Wade held up his hand. "Dawn," he said quietly. "I'll give you until dawn, Ms. Whitlock. But if you can't prove your claims by then, both your father and brother will face the rope." The crowd muttered and grumbled, but they began to disperse. Clara helped her bleeding brother to his feet while Mercy tended to Reverend Boone's wounds. Dawn was 6 hours away, 6 hours to save 2 lives and expose the truth that Willow Creek refused to see. Thunder rumbled overhead without rain, like the town's anger looking for a place to break. 2 o'clock in the morning found Clara, Mercy, and Silas huddled in the church crypt beneath the cemetery. The underground chamber was cold and damp, filled with stone coffins from Willow Creek's earliest days. Candles flickered between the graves, casting dancing shadows on limestone walls. "We can't stay here forever," Silas said, his voice hollow with despair. "Come dawn, they'll drag us all to the gallows." Clara sat beside her mother's medical journal, reading by candlelight for what felt like the 100th time. She'd been through every page, every notation, every scrap of medical knowledge her mother had collected during her years as a frontier nurse. "There has to be something," she muttered, "something I missed." Mercy kept watch at the crypt entrance, while Reverend Boone rested against a stone tomb, a bandage around his head from the mob's attack. His faith had been shaken but not broken. He still believed truth would prevail, even in this dark hour. "Clara," Mercy said softly, "maybe it's time to accept that some fights can't be won. We could slip away before dawn, head downriver." "No," Clara's voice was firm. "Papa dies if we run, and more people will keep getting sick from that poisoned grain." She turned another page in her mother's journal and stopped. There, in the margin of a chapter about ergot poisoning, was a note, written in her mother's careful handwriting. "When heated, ergot-caminated flour produces vivid purple discoloration, unmistakable sign of contamination." Clara stared at the words, her mind racing. Purple discoloration when heated. She'd seen the purple mold on raw grain, but what about cooked grain? What about bread? "Mercy," she said urgently, "do you remember what Mrs. Patterson said about Mayor Crane's bread? That it tasted sweet but wrong?" "She said it made her stomach churn," Mercy replied. "What if we could prove the contamination in front of everyone? What if we could make the poison visible?" Silas looked up from his corner. "What are you thinking?" Clara was already gathering her things. "I'm thinking about bread. 2 loaves of bread that will either save Papa's life or get us all killed." She explained her plan as they made their way through the cemetery toward the church kitchen. They would bake 2 loaves before dawn, one with clean flour from the general store, one with contaminated flour from Mayor Crane's granary. When heated, the ergot-tainted bread should show the telltale purple streaks her mother had documented. "It's dangerous," Mercy warned, "if Crane catches us stealing from his granary." "If we don't try," Clara replied. "Papa and Silas both die at sunrise." The kitchen felt enormous in the candlelight, its wooden counters and iron stove waiting for their desperate experiment. Clara had baked bread hundreds of times with her mother, but never with such stakes. As she mixed flour and water, she thought about all the people who dismissed her as a hysterical girl, all the men who'd refused to listen because she was young and female and inconvenient. Tomorrow, today really, they would have to listen. Evidence didn't care about gender or age. Scientific truth didn't bow to political pressure, and purple-stained bread would speak louder than any testimony. Outside, the night was fading toward gray. Dawn was coming, and with it the moment that would determine whether justice or ignorance ruled Willow Creek. Clara kneaded the dough with fierce determination, her mother's words echoing in her mind. When heated, ergot-contaminated flour produces vivid purple discoloration. She was about to stake 3 lives on the truth of that single sentence. The church kitchen became Clara's laboratory as she worked through the final hours before dawn. 2 batches of dough sat rising on the wooden counter, one made with clean flour from honest merchants, the other mixed with grain she'd stolen from Mayor Crane's private store. "The timing has to be perfect," Clara said as she stoked the fire in the cast-iron stove. "We need the bread fresh and hot when we present it." Mercy stood guard at the kitchen window while Silas helped tend the fire, despite his injured ankle. Reverend Boone had recovered enough to assist, though he moved slowly and his head wound still bled occasionally. "You understand the risk," Boone said quietly. "If this doesn't work, if the bread doesn't show what you expect, then we'll have tried," Clara replied, "and Papa will know we didn't abandon him." As the first loaf baked, Clara explained her plan. "We'll bring both loaves to the gallows at sunrise, cut them open in front of everyone. If I'm right, the contaminated bread will show purple streaks that prove the grain is poisoned. And if you're wrong?" Silas asked. Clara didn't answer, because they all knew what would happen. Without proof, without Dr. Price's testimony, without any way to demonstrate the truth, Jonas and Silas would both hang as the sun came up. The smell of baking bread filled the kitchen, warm and comforting despite the circumstances. Clara found herself thinking of peaceful mornings when her mother was alive, when the family gathered around this same table for breakfast, when their biggest worry was whether they had enough flour to last the week. "First batch is ready," Mercy announced. Clara pulled the clean loaf from the oven. It looked perfect, golden brown, crusty on top, smelling like home and safety. She set it aside to cool and slid the second loaf into the oven. This was the moment of truth. If her mother's medical notes were correct, if the contaminated flour really did produce purple streaks when heated, if her theory about ergot poisoning was right, 20 minutes later, she opened the oven door and gasped. The second loaf was streaked with vivid purple lines like veins of poison running through what should have been wholesome bread. The discoloration was unmistakable, impossible to explain away, undeniable proof of contamination. "Dear Lord," Reverend Boone breathed, "it's just like you said." Clara carefully lifted the poisoned loaf and set it beside its clean counterpart. The difference was stark. One golden and pure, the other mottled with purple that screamed danger to anyone with eyes to see. Outside, the sky was lightening toward dawn. Soon the crowd would gather at the gallows. Soon she would have to stand before the mob that had beaten her brother and threatened her family, armed with nothing but 2 loaves of bread and her mother's medical knowledge. But looking at the purple-streaked evidence in her hands, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in days. Certainty. Not just hope or theory or desperate faith, but absolute scientific certainty. The bread didn't lie. The poison was real. And in a few minutes, everyone in Willow Creek would have to face the truth they'd been so determined to ignore. Clara wrapped both loaves in clean cloth and prepared to save her father's life. Pale dawn light crept across Willow Creek as the crowd gathered in the town square. The gallows stood like a wooden monument to mob justice, its rope swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Clara walked toward it carrying a wicker basket, flanked by Mercy, Silas, and Reverend Boone. Behind them, someone led a squealing hog on a rope, their final piece of evidence. The crowd parted reluctantly as they approached. Faces showed exhaustion from the long night, but also grim satisfaction that justice would finally be served. Mayor Crane stood near the platform with the other council members, his expression confident and cold. At the gallows base, Sheriff Wade was preparing the rope while Jonas stood nearby, his hands bound, his face gray with resignation. When he saw his children approaching, something flickered in his eyes: surprise, hope, fear for their safety. "Papa?" Eli broke free from Reverend Boone's protective grip and ran to his father. The 9-year-old wrapped his small arms around Jonas's legs, crying openly. "What's this?" Judge Harrington demanded. "We agreed to sunrise. The sun is up." Clara stepped forward, her basket held high. "You agreed to let me prove Papa's innocence. I'm here to do exactly that." She pulled out both loaves of bread, one golden and perfect, one streaked with ominous purple veins. A murmur ran through the crowd as people saw the stark difference. "This," Clara announced in a clear voice, "is bread made from Mayor Crane's grain supply. As you can see, it's marked with purple streaks that indicate ergot poisoning, the same contamination that's been making people sick for weeks." "Lies!" Mayor Crane shouted. "Desperate lies from a murderer's daughter." But Clara was already cutting into the clean loaf, showing its pure white interior to the crowd. Then she sliced the contaminated bread, revealing purple veins running throughout like diseased blood vessels. "This is what killed those 6 people," she said. "Not Papa's medicine, but poisoned grain sold as food." "Prove it," someone called from the crowd. Clara nodded to Mercy, who brought forward the hog they'd borrowed from a local farmer. Without hesitation, Clara fed several slices of the purple-streaked bread to the animal. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Within minutes, the hog began trembling. Its movements became jerky and uncoordinated. Foam appeared at its mouth and its eyes rolled back as convulsions racked its body. The crowd stepped back in shocked silence as the animal collapsed, its breathing labored and irregular. Some people crossed themselves. Others stared in disbelief at the bread that had seemed so innocent moments before. "You see," Clara said, her voice carrying across the square, "the poison isn't in Papa's medicine, it's in the grain that's been sold to families throughout this town." Mayor Crane's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "This proves nothing. Anyone can poison an animal and claim, 'Then eat it yourself,'" Clara interrupted, holding out a slice of the purple-streaked bread. "If it's safe, if there's nothing wrong with your grain, then eat it." The crowd turned to stare at Mayor Crane, waiting for his response. He looked at the offered bread like it was a loaded gun pointed at his chest. The silence stretched until it became its own accusation. The hog's labored breathing filled the sudden quiet as Mayor Crane stared at the purple-streaked bread in Clara's outstretched hand. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his usual confident smile had vanished completely. "Well," Clara pressed, "if this bread is safe to sell to families, surely it's safe enough for you to eat." "This is ridiculous," Crane blustered, but his voice cracked slightly. "I won't be subjected to these theatrical games." But the crowd's mood was shifting. People who had been calling for Jonas's blood were now looking at their mayor with suspicion and dawning horror. Mrs. Patterson pushed forward from the back of the group. "I bought flour from your granary last week," she said accusingly. "My bread tasted just like that, sweet but wrong, made me sick for days." "Same here," called out the blacksmith. "My wife's been poorly ever since we started buying your grain." More voices joined in, a chorus of complaints that had been dismissed as coincidence, but now seemed like evidence of systematic poisoning. Clara saw understanding spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. She pulled out Mercy's detailed records and Mayor Crane's own ledger, stolen from his grain silo. "These documents show everything," she announced. "Months of buying damaged grain at reduced prices, mixing it with clean wheat to hide the contamination, selling it at full price while people got sick and died." Mercy stepped forward and began reading entries aloud in her clear, educated voice. March 15th. Purchased 200 pounds rye, grade C damaged, 30% below market rate. March 20th. Sold mixed grain to Patterson household. March 21st. Mrs. Patterson reported stomach ailment. The pattern was undeniable. Every purchase of cheap damaged grain was followed by sales to unsuspecting families and subsequent reports of illness. "You killed them," someone shouted from the crowd. "You killed them for money." The mood turned ugly, but this time the anger was directed at its proper target. Hands reached for Mayor Crane, but Sheriff Wade stepped between them. "That's enough," Wade commanded, drawing his pistol. "There'll be law and order here." But even as he maintained control, Wade was already moving toward Mayor Crane with the same shackles that had bound Jonas. The evidence was overwhelming, the crowd's verdict clear, and justice finally pointed in the right direction. "Abner Crane," Sheriff Wade announced formally, "you're under arrest for criminal negligence and fraud resulting in death." As the iron shackles clicked around Crane's wrists, Wade unlocked Jonas's bonds. Father and children embraced while the crowd watched in stunned silence, many faces showing shame for how quickly they'd condemned an innocent man. The hog gave one final shudder and lay still, a casualty of Clara's desperate proof. But its sacrifice had served its purpose. Truth had triumphed over fear, evidence over ignorance, justice over mob rule. Mayor Crane was led away in chains while Jonas Whitlock stood free under the morning sun, his daughter's courage having saved not just his life, but the soul of Willow Creek itself. By afternoon, the town hall buzzed with unprecedented activity. Citizens who had been calling for Jonas's blood that morning now worked to draft new laws that would prevent another poisoning crisis. Clara found herself appointed as interim medical examiner, the first woman to hold any official position in Willow Creek's history. The Pure Food Ordinance of Willow Creek, Judge Harrington read from the hastily written document, shall require inspection of all grain shipments, testing of suspected contamination, and criminal penalties for selling adulterated food products. Mercy sat at the council table, her sharp handwriting recording every word of the proceedings. When the vote came to elect a permanent clerk to replace the corrupt officials who had enabled Mayor Crane's schemes, her name was proposed and approved unanimously. Furthermore, Judge Harrington continued, this council formally apologizes to Jonas Whitlock and his family for the grave injustice they suffered and authorizes compensation for damages to their property and reputation. Clara listened from the gallery, still wearing her soot-stained dress from the morning's dramatic proof. Eli sat beside her, sketching the historic scene with careful attention to detail. Silas, his ankle finally properly bandaged, managed a slight smile for the first time in days. The afternoon sun streamed through the hall's windows, illuminating papers covered with fresh ink and new laws. For the first time since the nightmare began, Clara allowed herself to believe that something good might come from all the suffering. The town of Willow Creek, Judge Harrington concluded, hereby commits itself to the principles of scientific inquiry, evidence-based justice, and protection of the innocent. As the council members signed the documents, Clara thought about her mother's medical journal and the chain of knowledge that had saved her family. Education, careful observation, and stubborn refusal to expect convenient lies. These were the tools that had exposed the truth. Outside, workers were already dismantling the gallows that had nearly claimed Jonas and Silas. In its place, they planned to plant a garden where the community could grow clean, healthy food under careful supervision. The Pure Food Ordinance was a start, but Clara knew the real work was just beginning. Trust had to be rebuilt, systems had to be reformed, and vigilance had to be maintained to prevent future corruption. As the official proceedings concluded, Mercy approached with a small smile. So, interim medical examiner Whitlock, what's your first official act? Clara considered the question seriously. I think, she said finally, we need to burn every last grain of contaminated food in this town, and then we start over with honest merchants and tested supplies. It would take time to heal the wounds that fear and corruption had inflicted on Willow Creek, but for the first time in weeks, Clara felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and a teenage girl's determination had changed the course of an entire community. Evening brought the sweetest sound Clara had heard in weeks, her father's laughter echoing through their smoke-damaged home. The pharmacy walls still bore scorch marks from the arsonist's attack, and broken glass crunched underfoot, but Jonas was alive and free, and that made everything else seem manageable. I'm sorry I doubted, Jonas said as he pulled Clara into another embrace. I'm sorry I gave up hope. You didn't give up, Clara replied. You told me to find the truth, and that's exactly what I did. They sat around the kitchen table that had witnessed so many tense meals over the past week, but tonight felt different, peaceful, hopeful, like a family breathing freely after nearly drowning. What happens now, Papa? Eli asked, looking up from a drawing of the morning's dramatic events. Jonas surveyed the damaged shop through the doorway. We rebuild. Better than before. He turned to Clara with new respect in his eyes. And we open a free clinic 2 days a week. This town needs proper medical care, and after what you've proven today, I think people might actually listen to the Whitlock family's medical advice. Silas grinned despite his bandaged ankle. Can I help manage the supplies? I promise not to sneak out and get beaten up anymore. We'll all help, Clara said, and Reverend Boone offered to donate church pews for waiting benches. As if summoned by his name, Reverend Boone appeared at their door, his head bandage replaced with a smaller dressing. Behind him came Mercy carrying a basket of food from the church kitchen. Thought you might be hungry, Mercy said with a smile. Clean food, properly prepared, guaranteed safe. They shared the simple meal as evening settled over Willow Creek. Through the broken windows, Clara could see townspeople moving about their normal business, but with a new awareness, a careful attention to what they ate and where it came from. "There's something else," Jonas said as they finished eating. "I've been thinking about your mother's medical journal. All that knowledge shouldn't be hidden away. We should teach it, share it, make sure other people can spot the signs of contamination or poisoning." Clara felt a warm glow that had nothing to do with the oil lamps. "A school? Why not? You've got the mind for it, and after today, I think this town owes you whatever support you need." Later, as Clara prepared for bed in her narrow room above the shop, she reflected on the events that had transformed her from a quiet apothecary's daughter into a medical examiner and potential teacher. The week had been terrifying, but it had also shown her capabilities she never knew she possessed. Through her window, she could see the church where they'd found sanctuary, the square where she'd proven her father's innocence, and the river that had nearly carried away their last hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: rebuilding the pharmacy, establishing the clinic, teaching the community to recognize and prevent food contamination. But tonight, Clara fell asleep to the sound of her father humming an old song their mother used to love. The Whitlock family was whole again, and Willow Creek was beginning to heal. 1 week later, the entire community gathered on the farmland outside town for the Great Burning. Wagons loaded with contaminated grain created an enormous pile in the center of the field, while families came from miles around to witness the destruction of the poison that had terrorized their community. Clara stood with a torch in her hand, officially appointed to light the fire that would cleanse Willow Creek of its tainted food supply. Beside the grain pile sat a smaller stack of wood and rope, the dismantled gallows, about to meet the same fate as the corruption it had represented. "Before we begin," Sheriff Wade announced to the gathered crowd, "there's something else that needs addressing." A wagon approached from the main road, carrying clean seed from the state relief program. The bright grain looked like gold in the afternoon sunlight, promising fresh starts and untainted harvests. Clara applied her torch to the pile of contaminated grain and gallows wood. Flames caught quickly, sending black smoke spiraling into the clear sky. As the fire grew, people began to cheer. Not the angry shouts of a mob, but the relieved celebration of a community cleansing itself. "Let this fire burn away our mistakes," Reverend Boone called out as he offered a blessing. "Let it remind us that justice and truth must always burn brighter than fear and hatred." Mayor Crane sat shackled in a prison wagon at the edge of the field, watching his ill-gotten grain turn to ash. His trial would come later, but the evidence of his crimes was already turning to smoke and cinders. As the fire reached its peak, Clara began distributing the clean seed to families throughout the crowd. Each handful represented hope for future harvests, free from contamination, grown under the oversight of the new Pure Food Ordinance. "Plant it deep," she told each person. "Water it well. And remember, we're all responsible for keeping our food safe." Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who'd been among the first to suffer from contaminated grain, accepted her seed with tears in her eyes. "I misjudged you, child. I'm sorry for that." "We all made mistakes," Clara replied gently. "What matters is that we learn from them." The burning continued through the afternoon, reducing weeks of poisoned grain to harmless ash. Children played in the field while adults discussed plans for communal gardens and shared grain testing equipment. As sunset approached, Clara walked to the exact spot where the gallows had stood during that terrible dawn confrontation. Now it was just scorched earth, ready for new growth. She knelt and pressed a handful of clean rye seed into the warm soil, thinking of her mother's words about healing and second chances. The seeds felt firm and healthy under her fingers, full of potential for better harvests and safer food. "From poison, we plant healing," she whispered, then louder so others could hear. "From poison, we plant healing." The words became a chant, picked up by voices throughout the crowd. As the sun set over Willow Creek, the community spoke its commitment to a future built on truth, evidence, and the courage to confront corruption wherever it might hide. Clara smiled as she watched the last flames die down to glowing embers. The worst was behind them. The best was yet to come. The grand opening of the Whitlock Free Clinic brought more people than Clara had dared hope. A line stretched from the pharmacy door all the way to the church, with both black and white families waiting together for the first time in Willow Creek's history. Mercy sat at a table near the entrance, her careful handwriting recording the name of each patient in a large ledger book. "Next," she called, her voice warm and welcoming. Inside the renovated pharmacy, Jonas examined patients with renewed confidence, while Clara assisted with medications and Silas managed the supply shelves. Eli had appointed himself official messenger, running between the clinic and the church to fetch additional supplies as needed. "What seems to be troubling you today?" Clara asked a young mother holding a fussy baby. "Little James here hasn't been sleeping," the woman replied. "Cries all night, won't take his milk proper." Clara examined the baby carefully, checking his skin tone, the inside of his mouth, his general responsiveness. "Has he eaten anything unusual, any new foods in the past week?" "Just some cornbread I made from the last of our old flour," the mother said. Then her face went pale. "Oh no, you don't think—" "Bring me a sample of that flour," Clara said gently. "Let's test it to be sure." An hour later, Clara's testing confirmed mild ergot contamination in the flour. The baby had been getting trace amounts of the poison through his mother's milk, just enough to make him sick, but not enough to kill him. "Thank the Lord we caught it early," the mother said, tears streaming down her face. "Thank the Lord for your clinic." As the day progressed, Clara treated a dozen similar cases, lingering effects from contaminated food that people had been suffering with for weeks. An elderly man with trembling hands, a teenage girl with persistent headaches, a farmer with unexplained rashes on his arms. Each patient received not just treatment, but education about recognizing food contamination and preventing future poisoning. Clara demonstrated how to test grain for mold, how to identify suspicious discoloration, how to trust their instincts when food smelled or tasted wrong. "Knowledge is the best medicine," she told each family. "The more you understand about what you're eating, the safer you'll be." By late afternoon, they had seen 43 patients, more than the pharmacy usually treated in a month. But nobody was turned away and nobody was asked to pay. The State Relief Fund, combined with donations from grateful families, kept the clinic running. As the last patient left, Clara looked around the transformed pharmacy. The walls still showed scorch marks from the arsonist's attack, but now they were decorated with charts showing safe food handling practices and warning signs of contamination. The bell above the clinic door chimed softly as Reverend Boone arrived for his evening visit. "How did it go?" he asked. "Better than I dreamed," Clara replied, exhaustion and satisfaction mixing in her voice. "We're already helping people, making a real difference." As sunset painted the windows gold, Clara thought about how much had changed in just 2 weeks. A poisoned town had become a healing community. A condemned family had become respected medical providers, and a quiet apothecary's daughter had found her calling as a healer and teacher. The bell chimed again as the door closed behind the last visitor. Tomorrow would bring new patients, new challenges, new opportunities to serve, but tonight, Clara allowed herself to feel proud of what they'd accomplished. Willow Creek was learning to trust again, one patient at a time. 3 months later, spring had transformed Willow Creek into something Clara barely recognized. Green fields stretched beyond the town limits, planted with clean grain under the careful supervision of the new agricultural committee. The main street bustled with healthy activity, free from the fear and suspicion that had poisoned the community more thoroughly than any contaminated grain. Clara walked her morning route through the town square, past the spot where the gallows had once stood. Now it bloomed with wildflowers and young rye shoots, a living memorial to the importance of truth over convenience, evidence over emotion. The Whitlock Free Clinic had become the heart of the community's health efforts. Jonas taught proper food safety to anyone who would listen, while Clara conducted weekly classes in basic medical knowledge for mothers and farmers. Mercy's careful records tracked the dramatic improvement in public health since the contaminated grain supply had been eliminated. "Miss Clara," a young voice called from across the square. She turned to see Tommy Patterson, the grocer's son running toward her with a wide smile. He'd been one of her first patients at the clinic, suffering from mild ergot poisoning that had caused persistent headaches and nausea. "Look," Tommy held up a small wooden box. "I made this for you. It's for storing your medical supplies." Clara accepted the gift with genuine pleasure. The box was beautifully crafted with Whitlock Clinic carved into the lid in neat letters. "Thank you, Tommy. This is wonderful." "My pa says you saved my life," the boy said seriously. "Says the whole town would have kept getting sick if you hadn't figured out about the bad grain." "We all work together," Clara reminded him. "That's how communities stay healthy, by looking out for each other." As Tommy ran off to his morning chores, Clara continued her walk toward the river. The ferry landing bustled with legitimate commerce now, its grain storage areas properly ventilated and regularly inspected under the Pure Food Ordinance. She paused at the spot where she'd first noticed the purple mold that had started her investigation. The dock had been rebuilt and expanded, with proper drainage to prevent the damp conditions that encouraged fungal growth. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers from the memorial garden. Clara knelt and pressed her hand to the warm soil where new rye was sprouting. Green shoots reaching toward the sun, clean and healthy and full of promise. "From poison, we planted healing," she whispered, remembering the words that had become Willow Creek's unofficial motto. The town had learned hard lessons about the dangers of willful ignorance, the importance of questioning authority, and the power of evidence over emotion. But more importantly, they had learned to trust in the possibility of redemption and renewal. Clara rose and continued her walk, her mother's medical journal tucked under her arm, and Tommy's wooden box held carefully in her hands. The morning was bright with possibility, and she had patients to see, knowledge to share, and a community to help heal. Behind her, the rye shoots swayed in the breeze, growing stronger with each passing day. Just like the town they fed, just like the people they nourished, just like the hope they represented for a future built on truth instead of fear, the silence of ignorance had been broken. In its place grew the living sound of a community learning to trust again, one careful word at a time.